The shawl was still warm. That was the thing that broke Esther Bristol completely open, the thing that sent her to her knees in the red dust, beside the fence post at the edge of her property, with her hands pressed flat against her thighs and her throat working around a sound she could not release. The shawl was still warm, which meant he had not been gone long, which meant if she ran to the ridge right now, she might still see the silhouette of him against the pale Nevada sky, that long dark coat, and the way he sat a horse like he had been born in the saddle, like gravity itself had made a special arrangement with Gideon Abbott that did not apply to ordinary men. She did not run. She stood there and she made herself breathe, and she held the shawl against her chest with both arms crossed over it like she was holding a wound closed, and she stared at the place on the horizon where the trail bent around the butte and disappeared, and she felt the full terrible weight of what it meant that he had left without saying goodbye, without knocking on the door, without one word. He had simply folded that shawl, the deep burgundy wool one she had admired 3 weeks ago in Harlan's dry goods store without buying because she could not spare the coin, and he had draped it over the top rail of her fence post in the cold gray hour before dawn, and he had ridden away. He had ridden away and he had not looked back. She knew that last part with a certainty that had nothing to do with having seen it. She knew it because Gideon Abbott was the kind of man who, once he made a decision, did not permit himself the weakness of looking back. She had learned that about him in 6 weeks, and in 6 weeks she had learned more about him than she had learned about her late husband Clarence in 6 years of marriage. That knowledge terrified her now in ways it had not terrified her before, because before, he had still been here. Before, there had been the possibility that the secrets between them could be resolved rather than abandoned. But the shawl was warm, and he was gone, and somewhere between the beginning of this impossible thing and its ending, Esther Bristol had made the catastrophic mistake of falling in love with a man who carried a dark past so heavy it bent him at the spine when he thought no one was watching. She pressed her lips to the wool. It smelled like wood smoke and something else, something clean and male and unmistakably him, and she let herself have that one private moment of grief before she straightened her back and looked out at the land that was hers and hers alone now, the 37 acres of scrub and promise that she had fought to keep after Clarence died, and she told herself the same thing she had been telling herself since she was 17 years old and the world first showed her its teeth. You have survived worse than this, Esther. But even as she thought it, she knew it was not true. She had not survived anything quite like this, because this was not loss in the ordinary sense. This was something more complicated than loss. This was a man riding away from something real because he believed, in his hidden and locked and deeply scarred heart, that real things had a way of getting destroyed when they got too close to him. This was Gideon Abbott making a choice that was not entirely about her at all, and that, perversely, was the thing she could not forgive him for. Not yet. She turned back toward the house, the shawl wrapped around her shoulders where he had clearly intended it to go, and she walked across the yard in the early morning light of October 1883, and she thought about the first time she had ever seen him. It had been 6 weeks ago, which in the high desert of northern Nevada felt like a different era entirely, because the seasons turned sharp and sudden out here, and time moved differently when you were alone. Esther had been alone for 14 months by then, since Clarence Bristol had died of a fever that came on fast and left no room for arrangements or goodbyes of any kind. Clarence had not been a warm man, and he had not been a particularly kind one, but he had been competent and steady, and the farm had functioned under his management in ways it struggled to function under hers. Not because she was incapable. She was more than capable. But because the land required more hands than two, and the neighbors were spread thin across the basin, and the nearest town of Redrock was a 2-hour ride that she could not always afford to make. She had been managing. That was the honest word for it. Not thriving, not sinking, but managing, which in 1883 in the Nevada Territory was not nothing. She had a garden that produced enough. She had 6 chickens, a milk cow named Margaret, and a horse named Biscuit who was 15 years old and deeply unimpressed by everything. She had the 37 acres and the deed to them, which she had fought Clarence's brother Owen for, in a proceeding that the circuit judge had found in her favor only because the law had been recently revised to recognize a widow's right to property that she had worked alongside her husband. Owen Bristol had not forgiven her for that. Owen Bristol lived in Redrock and ran the feed store and had opinions about women who forgot their place, and he had made those opinions known in ways both loud and quiet over the 14 months since his brother's death. She did not fear Owen precisely, but she did not discount him either. He was the kind of man whose grievances calcified over time into something harder and more dangerous than the original feeling, and she was aware that the longer she held onto the farm, the more dangerous that calcification was becoming. All of which was the context into which Gideon Abbott rode on a Tuesday morning in early September when the light was still golden and the air still carried the last warmth of summer. She had been mending the fence along the north pasture when she heard the horse, and she had straightened and turned with her hammer still in her hand, because out here you did not let yourself be caught unaware, not even in daylight, not even on your own land. The rider came up the road at a walk, which was the first thing she noted. A man in a hurry or a man with bad intentions came at a faster pace. This one walked his horse like he had nowhere particular to be and no particular reason to rush toward it. He was tall in the saddle in the way that men who had spent their whole lives on horseback were tall, the height distributed and easy rather than stiff. He wore a dark canvas coat that had been good quality once and had aged into something better, the kind of coat that showed its history without being ruined by it. His hat was pulled low against the morning sun, which put his face in shadow until he got close enough that she could see the jaw first, strong and unshaven, and then the eyes, which were a shade of gray that she had not seen before on a person, not blue-gray or green-gray but true gray, the color of water under a clouded sky. He stopped his horse at the fence line without being asked to, which was the second thing she noted. Good manners, or at least an understanding of the etiquette of other people's land. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and even, not the aggressive friendliness of a man who wanted something, just a simple acknowledgement of the hour. "Morning," she said, and did not lower the hammer. He noticed that, or she thought he did, because something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile but adjacent to one. "I saw your post in town, looking for a hand." She had put that notice on the board at Harlan's General Store 3 weeks prior, partly out of desperation and partly out of the calculation that the harvest would not complete itself, and she could not do it alone without losing half to rot or weather. She had not expected many responses because the pay she was offering was modest, and the work was hard, and she was known locally as a woman who had opinions and the stubbornness to defend them. "You have experience?" she asked. "Some," he said, which was exactly the kind of answer she distrusted. "Some covers a wide range," she said. "I need someone who can repair a roof, manage a harvest, fix a plow blade, and handle a horse that has strong opinions about strangers." He looked across the pasture for a moment, assessing, and she had the odd sensation that he was assessing more than the land. "I can do all of those things," he said, "and I won't give you trouble." "Everyone says that," she said. "I know," he said, and something in his voice when he said it made her feel the weight of the statement differently than she had intended, like he was not making a sales pitch. Like he was simply stating a fact about himself that he had had occasion to state before and found it unfortunate that it always needed to be stated. His name was Gideon Abbott. He was 31 years old. He had drifted into the Nevada territory from somewhere he did not specify, but his hands, when he reached across the fence to shake hers, told a clear and detailed story of long, hard labor, rope and wood and metal and soil, all written into the calluses and the scars that she noted without staring. She hired him on a week's trial at $1.25 per week with meals provided, which was fair for the area, and she showed him the small outbuilding behind the barn where her last hand, a Paiute man named Samuel who had moved south to be near family, had slept. He thanked her without excess. He unsaddled his horse, a big dark bay named Nothing that she ever learned, and he got to work within the hour without being told what needed doing first, which was the moment she understood that this was a man who knew how to read a property and identify its most urgent needs. He started on the roof. She watched him from the kitchen window for longer than she should have. That was the beginning of the first week, and the first week was purely practical in the way that two people focused on urgent physical work can be purely practical. The harvest was the priority, and the harvest required both of them moving from before sunrise to after sunset with breaks only for meals, and the kind of muscular exhaustion that made conversation feel like a luxury. She cooked and he ate without complaint or excessive gratitude, just the clean acknowledgement of hunger met that she found, after Clarence's silent contempt for everything she put on the table, unexpectedly moving. He repaired the roof. He fixed the plow blade with a technique she had not seen before, heating the metal and reshaping it rather than replacing it, which saved her the cost of the smithing. He managed Biscuit, the 15-year-old horse, with a patience that the animal rewarded by developing what could only be described as an attachment, following Gideon around the paddock when he was not riding, and making low sounds of equine satisfaction that Biscuit had never previously offered to anyone. He was quiet. That was the most consistent thing about him. Not unfriendly quiet, not hostile quiet, but the quiet of a man who had long ago made his peace with silence and found it preferable to unnecessary noise. He spoke when there was something to say. He listened in a way that she slowly realized was unusual, really listened, full attention given without the restlessness or the half-presence that most people offered in conversation. At the end of the first week she paid him, and he folded the money into his coat pocket without counting it, which she later thought told her something important. She hired him for a second week. The second week was when things began to change, subtly and in ways that she found herself analyzing late at night when she should have been sleeping. It was not anything dramatic. There was no single moment she could point to as the turning point. It was more like a slow brightening, the way the sky lightens before sunrise, all the increments too small to isolate but the cumulative effect undeniable. He made her laugh on the Wednesday of the second week. That was probably the first notable thing. She had said something wry about the behavior of the chickens, some dry remark about how they had more opinions about the morning feeding schedule than the territorial legislature had about women's suffrage, and he had looked at her with those gray eyes and said, without any particular effort at performance, that in his experience chickens were considerably more organized than the territorial legislature. And she had laughed in a way she had not laughed in a very long time, from the belly, surprised out of herself. He had watched her laugh with an expression she did not immediately know how to read, but which she later understood as something careful and complicated, a man seeing something he had not expected to see, and not quite knowing what to do with the feeling it produced. They began to talk in the evenings, after supper, sitting on the porch in the cooling air with cups of coffee that she made strong enough to be worth making. He talked about the places he had been, the territories and states he had passed through in the years he had been moving, Texas and Colorado and New Mexico and Arizona, always moving, never for very long in one place. He talked about those places with the detail of a man who paid close attention to the world and remembered what he saw, the particular quality of the light in different regions, the way the land changed as you moved from one place to another, the different ways people organized their lives in different climates. He did not talk about why he was always moving. She noticed that absence and she filed it carefully. There was a border in his self-disclosure that he maintained with consistency, everything this side of a certain line, nothing beyond it. She was too practical to push at that border directly. She understood, in the way that people who have lived hard lives develop a quiet fluency in other people's hidden wounds, that the border existed because what was on the other side of it had caused damage that had not finished healing. She also understood that a man who maintained that border was not necessarily a dishonest man. He was simply a man who was still working out what to do with certain parts of his own history. She respected the border. She did not stop wondering what was behind it. The third week was when Owen Bristol rode out to the farm. He came on a Friday afternoon when Gideon was up on the barn roof, replacing shingles that had blown loose in a recent storm. Esther was in the garden harvesting the last of the squash when she heard the hoofbeats and looked up to see her late husband's brother coming down the road, with that particular set to his shoulders that meant he had come with a purpose and intended to make the purpose felt. Owen Bristol was 43 years old and had the look of a man who had once been physically strong and had translated that into a posture of authority that he had never stopped believing was warranted. He was not a large man, but he made himself large in the way he moved and spoke. He had Clarence's coloring, the sandy hair gone gray at the temples, the pale eyes that looked like a washed-out sky, but none of whatever particular quality Clarence had possessed that had made him, at the very least, predictable. Owen's eyes moved around too much. He tied his horse at the post and looked at the barn roof before he looked at her, a long, calculating look that she understood was meant to communicate that he had noticed the hired hand. "Esther," he said by way of greeting. "Owen," she said. "Got yourself some help," he said. "I do," she said, and offered nothing further. He walked toward her through the garden with the proprietary ease of a man who had decided the property was more his than hers, stepping between rows without being careful about it. And she watched his boots come close to the squash vines and made herself stay quiet because the calculation she was doing told her that this was not the moment to fight about squash vines. He talked around what he had come to say for a good 10 minutes, asking about the harvest yield, making observations about the condition of the east pasture, mentioning that the Galloways down the road had sold to a land company out of San Francisco, and he thought that was probably the smart move, considering how hard it was for a single woman to manage land of this size. She answered him with the minimum of words and the maximum of composure, and all the while she was aware of Gideon on the barn roof, and she suspected Owen was aware of him too, in that sideways assessing way Owen had of cataloging everything around him. "The thing is," Owen said finally, landing on the real purpose the way a hawk lands after circling, "the property tax assessment came in for next quarter, and it's gone up. Territorial expansion, they're saying. New roads, you aware of that?" She was not. "How much?" he told her, and the number was high enough that she felt it physically, a cold compression in her chest. She kept her face neutral. "That's going to be difficult," she said, which was the understatement of the year. "It would be," he said, and there was something almost satisfied in his voice. "Unless you had help, financial help. Now I've been thinking, and I think the fair thing, given that this was my brother's land." "My land," she said. "Given that this was Clarence's land," he continued undeterred, "is that I offer you a fair price. Take it off your hands. You'd have capital, you could go somewhere, start over somewhere smaller, something more suited to—" "I'm not selling," she said. He looked at her with those pale, washed-out eyes, and she could see the calcification she had been monitoring, the grievance hardening a little further behind his gaze. "Esther, you're a stubborn woman, and I've always respected that about you, but stubbornness doesn't pay taxes." "I'll manage," she said. He left 20 minutes later without having moved her, and she stood in the garden after his horse disappeared around the bend and breathed very carefully for a moment, adding the numbers in her head, working out what would have to be sold or deferred or sacrificed. The calculation was not cheerful. "He's going to be a problem." She looked up. Gideon had come down from the roof and was standing at the edge of the garden, hat in his hands, watching the road where Owen had gone. "He already is a problem," she said. "I mean a larger one," Gideon said. He met her eyes, and she had the sense that he was choosing his next words with care. "Men like that don't stop. They wait and they maneuver and they come back with a better angle. I know what kind of man he is, she said. Then you know you need more than stubbornness to hold him off, he said, not unkindly. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you offering advice or just observations? I'm not sure yet, he said, and the honesty of that made her trust it more than a confident answer would have. They stood there in the cooling afternoon, and the trouble that Owen represented hung between them like weather. And Esther felt, with a clarity that almost frightened her, that this man standing at the edge of her garden with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes steady on hers was the kind of person she had been hoping to meet for a very long time, and that the hope itself was probably the most dangerous thing about her current situation. She sent him back up to finish the roof, and she went inside to sit with the tax numbers, and she did not let herself think about gray eyes or steady voices until well after dark, when there was nothing useful left to do with the thinking. The fourth week changed things irrevocably, which she supposed was the nature of fourth weeks between two people who had spent the first three building the foundation for something neither of them had intended to build. It happened on a Wednesday evening after supper, when the sky had gone the deep, clear violet of the desert evening, and the first stars were appearing above the eastern ridge. She had brought coffee to the porch as had become their custom, and he had been quiet through dinner in a way that was different from his usual comfortable quiet, a tension in it that she had noticed without addressing. She had waited for him to say whatever was sitting in him because she had learned by now that he could not be pushed and that patience usually worked where pressure did not. I need to tell you something, he said, looking out at the ridge rather than at her. All right, she said, a long pause, the kind of pause that was working something through, organizing something. Before I came here, I was in Arizona territory. There was trouble. I was involved in trouble and I left because of it, and I need you to know that in case it follows me here. She kept her voice even. What kind of trouble? He was quiet again and she waited, because this was clearly a moment that required the most careful handling she had ever given anything. There was a man named Hargrove, he said, Cass Hargrove. He ran a cattle operation in the Sulphur Springs Valley, and he had a way of running it that involved taking things that weren't his. Land mostly, water rights. He had the county sheriff in his pocket and a few other men of influence besides. He paused. I worked for him for 8 months before I understood fully what I was helping him do. And when I understood it, I refused to continue. And then some things happened that I am not proud of, but which were necessary, and Cass Hargrove lost property and influence and men, and I left before the consequences of all of that could find me. He turned and looked at her then, and his face was very still in the way that faces go still when a person is bracing themselves for a judgment they believe they deserve. Did you hurt anyone? She asked. Not permanently, he said, which she understood to mean that there had been violence of some kind, controlled and purposeful, without fatal conclusion. Are you wanted? She asked. Not legally, he said. Hargrove couldn't go to the law without explaining what the law would find when it looked at him. But he has men who are not the law, and they have instructions. She turned this over in her mind carefully, examining it from different angles the way you examine a piece of wood for structural integrity before you commit it to load-bearing use. She was looking for the deception in it, for the hidden motive that would reframe the story in a way that made him dangerous to her. She did not find it. What she found instead was the portrait of a man who had made a mistake in choosing his employer, corrected that mistake at significant personal cost, and then been honest with her about all of it rather than letting her operate in ignorance. Is there anything else you think I need to know? She asked. Something moved through his face, a complicated sequence she watched without entirely understanding. Yes, he said. She waited. I came to Reed Rock because it was quiet and I needed quiet. I planned to stay a month and then move on. I didn't plan to stay as long as I have, and I didn't plan. He stopped. He looked out at the stars. You didn't plan what? She asked, and her voice was quieter than she had intended. This, he said simply, and the word encompassed, she understood, exactly what she thought it encompassed. The air between them on that porch in the October evening was very full for a long moment, full of everything that had accumulated over 4 weeks of proximity and work and conversation, and the particular intimacy of two people who were both fundamentally honest doing honest work together. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she rarely was. "Neither did I," she said. He looked at her then, directly, with those gray eyes that held something she recognized as the specific combination of wanting and fear that characterized people who had been hurt before and were standing at the edge of being vulnerable again. He did not kiss her that night. He went back to the outbuilding with a good night that was careful and quiet, and she sat on the porch alone for another hour and looked at the stars and made a series of internal decisions that were both terrifying and, she admitted to herself in the private dark of her own mind, something very close to joy. The 5th week was when Hargrove's men arrived, which meant that joy, as it so often did, arrived with complications attached. There were 2 of them. They came into Redrock on a Thursday, which Gideon learned from a man at the feed store who had been watching strangers roll into town, with the territorial vigilance of someone who had lived long enough in a small community to notice when the usual pattern was disturbed. The man who told him was Tom Gallagher, who worked at the livery stable and had a weathered face and careful eyes, and no particular reason to lie about what he had seen. Gideon came back to the farm from town that Thursday afternoon with provisions, and with a stillness about him that was different from his regular stillness, heavier and more deliberate, the stillness of a man preparing himself for something he had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. He told Esther directly and without embellishment. 2 men, Hargrove's men almost certainly, the descriptions matching what he knew, now in Redrock asking questions. He told her this the way he told her everything, clearly, without softening it into something less than it was, giving her the information she needed to make her own decisions. "You need to go," she said, and her voice was very flat and controlled. "Yes," he said. "How long do you think you have before they find out you're here?" "A day," he said. "Maybe 2. Redrock is small." She looked at him and felt the full weight of the forced choice this was, the way it had arrived without asking permission, the way good things in her life had a tendency to be complicated by forces that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the world being structured in ways that did not favor women who held their own land and men who had the integrity to refuse to be instruments of other people's cruelty. "There's a canyon," she said, 8 miles north, Dry Bone Canyon. There's a cave system in the eastern wall, old Paiute shelter sites, well hidden from the trail. You could— "I'm not hiding in a cave while you're here alone," he said. "Gideon," she said. "I'm not doing that," he said again, and his voice was not loud, but it was very clear. She looked at him and understood that arguing this point would cost time they did not have. "Then we think of something else," she said. They thought of something else. The something else was a combination of practical measures and the willingness of 2 or 3 people in Redrock, who had their own reasons for preferring that Hargrove's tentacles not extend into the Nevada territory. Tom Gallagher at the livery was one of them. The circuit court clerk, a meticulous woman named Mrs. Pearl Adler who had once had dealings with Hargrove's land operations in Arizona and had not forgotten them, was another. Between these small alliances and the geographic reality of a territory that was large and sparsely populated, there were options. The confrontation happened on Saturday, not in Redrock but at the farm, because one of Hargrove's men was thorough enough to trace Gideon's recent history to Esther's property. His name was Deke, a lean man with a sun-reddened face and eyes that had a flat professional quality, the eyes of a man who treated his work as a pure transaction with no emotional contamination. His companion hung back near the road, hand near his holster, while Deke came to the door. Esther opened the door. Deke looked at her with those flat transactional eyes. "Looking for a man named Gideon Abbott," he said. "I've had a few hands working the farm this season," Esther said. "Describe him." Deke described him. Esther listened with the careful attention of a woman who had learned long ago that the most effective kind of lying was the kind that did not require you to say anything false. "I had a man matching that description for a week about 2 months back," she said. "Moved on. Thought he was heading toward California." Deke looked at her for a long time with those flat eyes, and she held his gaze without blinking because she had spent 14 months holding her ground against Owen Bristol's particular brand of pressure, and she had developed a capacity for stillness under scrutiny that was considerable. "You sure about that?" Deke said. "I'm sure I haven't seen anyone matching that description in some time," she said, which was technically true in the most creative interpretation of the word some. Gideon was not at the farm. Per the plan they had worked out the previous night, he was 2 miles east at the Gallagher property, helping Tom with a project that provided legitimate cover for his absence from Esther's land. The plan had required trust, specifically the trust that Esther would handle this conversation alone, which she had insisted on because she was the one who lived here, and she was the one who had standing to claim ignorance. Deke and his companion left without incident, and Esther went inside and stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table for a full minute, breathing through the aftermath of the specific terror of that kind of controlled performance, the performance of calm over a heart that had been doing something quite different from calm. When Gideon came back that evening, he found her at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and 2 cups of coffee already poured, and she told him what had happened, and he listened to every word with an intensity that was almost physical. And when she finished, he looked at her in a way that she would remember for a very long time, a look that contained both relief and something much more complicated than relief. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you did it anyway." "I did," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him working through whatever was happening inside him, the complicated algebra of a man who has spent years believing he is something that should be moved away from rather than toward, being confronted with evidence that contradicts that belief in the most direct possible way. "Esther," he said, and her name in his voice was different from how he had said it before, weighted with something. "Don't," she said, because she could see where he was going, could see the speech forming in him. The speech about how she deserved better than the complications his presence brought, the generous and self-defeating speech that men like Gideon Abbott gave when they were terrified. He stopped. "Just drink your coffee," she said. And he did, and they sat there in the lamplight with the night pressing against the windows, and something settled between them that was past the stage of pretending to be anything other than what it was. He kissed her 2 days later, on a Monday morning in the barn while she was brushing Margaret the cow, which was possibly the least romantic setting imaginable, and which was, in the way that true things tend to be, exactly right. He came in out of the early light with a look on his face that had resolved itself of all its usual caution, and he said her name again in that weighted way. And when she turned, he was close enough that the choice was already made by the geography of it. And his hands came up and held her face with a gentleness that was completely at odds with the size and strength of them. And he kissed her with the specific careful honesty of a man who did not do anything by halves, and who had been holding this back for as long as he could hold it. She kissed him back with everything she had been holding back on her own side, which was considerable. When they separated, he was looking at her with those gray eyes, and there was nothing careful in them at all for once. They were wide open, and she understood that she was seeing something that most people probably never got to see, the actual unguarded interior of Gideon Abbott, who kept himself so carefully contained as a general rule that this openness was almost startling. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Stay, be in one place, be with someone." "I know you don't," she said. "But you know how to learn things. You've been learning things your whole life. This is just another thing to learn." He looked at her for a long time. "You make it sound manageable." "It is manageable," she said, "if you want it to be." He kissed her again, and Margaret made a sound of bovine indifference. An outside biscuit could be heard in the paddock making his small, contented noises, and the morning light came through the barn boards in long golden lines, and Esther Bristol felt, for the first time in a very long time, like the future was a direction worth moving toward. The following 3 weeks were the best of her life. That was simply true, and she allowed herself to know it without the superstitious shrinking from good fortune that hardship had taught her. Gideon stayed. He worked the land and he worked it well, and in the evenings they sat on the porch and talked about everything, properly talked, the kind of conversations that build a shared world between two people, what they believed, what they feared, what they found beautiful, what they wanted from the shape of their days. He told her more about his past in measured, careful pieces, the childhood in Kentucky that had been marked by poverty and a father who had expressed his frustrations with the world physically and without remorse, the years of working his way west and learning various trades, the time in Texas with a cattle outfit that had been honest and good, and the first place he had ever felt genuinely competent, the drift into Arizona, and the mistake of Cass Hargrove. She told him things she had not told anyone in years. The marriage to Clarence, which had been an arrangement more than a love match, the grief that was more about loneliness than loss when he died, the fight for the land and what it had meant to her to win it, not just the land itself but the principle of it, the demonstration that she was not subject to the arbitrary authority of men who believed her incapable simply because she was a woman. He listened to all of it, every word, with the full attention he gave everything, and she watched him incorporate it into his understanding of her, watched him revise his picture of her in real time with each new piece, and she found that the feeling of being truly known was both more powerful and more terrifying than she had expected. Owen Bristol came back in the 5th week. He came with a different approach this time, and she recognized it as the better angle that Gideon had predicted. He came with a man named Prescott, a lawyer from the territorial capital who had papers. The papers related to a clause in Clarence's original land acquisition that Owen claimed established a reversionary interest in the estate in the event of Clarence dying without direct heirs. It was, in short, a legal trap, a potentially sophisticated one. Gideon was in the south field when they arrived, and Esther received them on the porch and looked at the papers and kept her face very still. "You'll want time to review them," Owen said, with the particular smoothness of someone who has deployed a weapon and is now performing magnanimity. "I've asked Prescott to give you a week." After they left, she stood on the porch and read the papers again more carefully. The clause was real. Whether it was the trap, Owen believed it to be depended on details of the original land grant that she did not have in front of her, but which she knew existed somewhere, because she had read every document related to this property multiple times since Clarence's death, and she had a very good memory. Gideon came up from the field, and she showed him the papers without comment. He read them slowly and carefully, and then he said, "This hinges on the original grant being classified as a conditional purchase. If it was an outright fee simple conveyance, this clause is unenforceable." She looked at him. "How do you know that?" "I spent 3 months working for a land attorney in Colorado," he said, which was one of the many practical skills his peripatetic life had deposited in him. "He was a good man, and I learned a great deal by proximity." "The original grant documents are in the strong box," she said. "I have copies." "Then let's look at them," he said. They spent that evening at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up as high as it would go, spreading documents and reading through the language of the original land purchase from 8 years prior, when Clarence had acquired the property from a homesteader named Beaumont, who had decided the desert was not for him. The language of the deed was, as Esther's memory had suggested, unambiguous, fee simple, outright conveyance, no conditions, no reversionary language of any kind. The clause Owen was citing appeared in a separate document that Prescott had either written recently or had excavated from somewhere irrelevant. "This is not legitimate," Gideon said, setting down the papers. "No," she said. "He knows it isn't legitimate," Gideon said. "Of course he does," she said. "He's betting I don't know enough to challenge it, or that even if I do, the cost of the legal fight will exhaust me before the principle of the thing is established." Gideon looked at her across the table and she saw him processing something, deciding something. "Mrs. Pearl Adler," he said, "the circuit clerk. She notarizes land documents. She would have access to the original filing records for this territory." "She would," Esther said, "and she dislikes Hargrove, which suggests she has a principled objection to men who manipulate land law to take things from people," Gideon said. "I think she would help." He was right. Pearl Adler was small, precise, and had the organized ferocity of a person who had spent 30 years managing documents that represented the entire real and legal lives of the people around her, and who had seen enough fraud in those documents to have strong opinions about it. She looked at Owen's papers with her reading glasses on and her mouth pressed thin, and said that the clause Owen was citing had no referential history in the original filing, which meant it was either an error or an invention, and that if Esther wanted to bring this to the circuit judge, she would be prepared to testify to that effect. Owen Bristol's second approach collapsed within the week. He did not take it gracefully. He said things to Esther at the courthouse that were loud enough to carry to the street, things about her character and her prospects and what happened to women who thought they were something they were not. And she stood on the courthouse steps and looked at him with the full height of her self-possession and said, in a voice that was perfectly level, that she had the deed, she had the clerk's testimony, and she had the judge's ruling. And if he spoke to her in this manner again, she would add harassment to the list of things the circuit judge was hearing about him. He went quiet in a particular way, the way of a man recalculating. She knew he was not finished. But she also knew that each failed approach cost him something: credibility and energy, and the patience of men like Prescott who worked for fees and had other clients. She had not won the war, but she had won the battle, and in her current situation that was sufficient. She came home to find Gideon on the porch with supper already made, which she had not expected, and she sat down and ate and told him what had happened in full, and he listened with his full attention as he always did. And when she finished, he said, quietly and with a directness that was characteristic of him, "You are the most formidable person I have ever met." She looked at him. "I mean that without reservation," he said. She felt the warmth of that land in her chest and settle, and she thought that this was what it felt like to be seen completely and approved of completely, and that she had not known before this how much she had wanted to know that feeling. After supper, he brought out the old guitar that had been hanging on the wall of the outbuilding since before she had owned the property, and it turned out that Gideon Abbott could play, quietly and without performance, old songs she recognized from her childhood in Ohio, songs about rivers and leaving and coming home. She sat on the porch steps with her coffee and listened, and the night was very clear, and the stars were extraordinary, the high desert stars that always struck her with their abundance, and she felt something that she would later understand was the specific happiness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the presence of something worth protecting. He played until the cold drove them inside, and at the door she turned and he was close, and she put her hand flat against his chest, over his heart just that, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood like that for a moment, and then she said good night and went inside, and she heard him go down the steps and cross the yard to the outbuilding, and she pressed her back against the closed door and breathed. In the 5th week there was also the matter of the letter. It came on a Thursday, addressed to Gideon, which itself was interesting because it required someone to know he was here. The postmark was Tucson, Arizona. He read it at the breakfast table while she did not watch him, or tried not to, and when he set it down his face had gone to its most controlled register, the register she had learned to recognize as the one he used when something was costing him to remain calm about. She did not ask. She waited. He folded the letter and put it in his coat and said, "Hargrove is dead." She looked up. "Fever, 2 months ago." He paused. "The letter is from a man named Cortez who was one of the ranch hands there, one of the honest ones. He tracked down my last known address through someone I'd stayed with in New Mexico." Another pause. Cass Hargrove is dead, and the men he had looking for me were his personal employees, not an organization that survives him. Without Hargrove to pay them, their mandate is finished. Esther put down her coffee cup. So the danger that followed you here, she said, is gone, he said. The word gone sat in the kitchen between them for a moment, and she felt the full significance of it spreading outward into all the implications it carried. The danger was gone. There was no longer a practical justification for Gideon to keep moving. There was no longer a threat that made his presence here a risk to her. The landscape of their situation had just changed entirely, and they were both standing in the new landscape looking at each other with the awareness of what it meant. "That's good news," she said. "Yes," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. Then she stood up and began clearing the breakfast things because she did not trust herself to say what she wanted to say in a controlled manner, and she needed the activity to organize herself. She wanted to say, "Stay." She wanted to say, "There is no reason to leave now." She wanted to say, "You have been learning to stay and you have been doing well at it, and I do not want to wake up in this house and look at this land without you here." She said none of those things. She cleared the breakfast things, and he went out to start the day's work, and she watched him go through the window and felt the complicated, beloved, frightening weight of loving someone who had a dark past and a habit of motion and the specific vulnerability of a man who did not believe he deserved the things he wanted. She resolved to say it plainly, that evening on the porch. She resolved to be as direct as she always was, with everything else in her life, with this. She would say, "I want you to stay. I'm not asking because I need the help, though I do. I am asking because I love you and I believe you love me, and I think that is something worth staying for." She was composing the exact phrasing when, at midday, Owen Bristol rode past the property on the road, not stopping but slow, watching, and he raised his eyes to the farmhouse, and she saw, from the kitchen window, the look on his face as he registered Gideon in the south field. Owen had not known, before this moment, that she had a man on her property who was anything other than a seasonal hand, a man with no stake in what happened here. The quality of his look as he processed what he was seeing, the calculation that moved across his features, told her that this new information was being added to whatever plan he was currently developing, and that its addition changed the plan in some way she could not yet calculate. He rode on without stopping. She watched him go and filed the information carefully and thought about the evening conversation she was planning, and she understood that the timing now carried an additional urgency. Because whatever Owen Bristol was calculating, the presence of Gideon in her life was either a strength she could draw on or a vulnerability she was creating for a man she loved, and she could not fully know which without knowing more about what Owen intended. The evening conversation happened, but not entirely as she had planned it. They were on the porch, the coffee made, the sky going its violet and the stars coming in, and she had opened her mouth to begin when he said, "I need to tell you what I'm thinking." She closed her mouth and waited. He was looking out at the ridge, and he had the quality of a man who has organized a difficult thing and is now delivering it with all the care that organization allows. "I've been thinking about this since the letter this morning, about what it means that the danger is resolved, about what it means for what I've been building here, what we've been building." She waited. He turned and looked at her. The evening light did something particular to his face, softened the angles without softening the intensity, and he looked at her with those gray eyes open and honest and said, "I don't want to leave." She felt the words land with a physical quality. "But I need to know that you want me to stay for the right reasons," he said. "Not because you need a hand, not because Owen Bristol is a problem that's easier to manage with someone else present, because those are real things and I understand them and I would help with them regardless of anything else, but I need them not to be the reason." She understood what he was asking. He was asking her to confirm that he was being chosen for himself and not for his utility, which was the fear of a man who had spent a long time being useful in various ways to various people, and who had rarely been simply wanted for his own existence. "Gideon," she said, and her voice came out lower and more certain than she expected. "I have managed this farm alone for 14 months. I have defended my legal right to this land against Clarence's brother and a hired attorney. I have stood on my own courthouse steps and told a man twice my size to take his grievances elsewhere. I am not a woman who needs rescuing." He nodded. "I want you to stay," she said, "because you are the only person I have met in my adult life with whom I feel genuinely understood. Because you listen. Because you are honest even when honesty is costly. Because you make me laugh in a way I had forgotten I knew how to laugh." She paused. "Because I love you, and I believe that is sufficient reason." The silence after that was very full. He moved from his chair and sat on the step beside her, close, and took her hand in his, and held it with the same careful gentleness as always, and said, "I love you, Esther. I have loved you for 3 weeks and been terrified of it for all 3 of them." She laughed, which broke the solemnity in exactly the right way, and he laughed too, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there in the violet evening with the stars coming in above the ridge, and all the fear and restraint and careful management of the previous weeks fell away and left something simple and real in its place. He asked her to marry him on the following Sunday. He did it properly. He came to the house in the morning in his best clothes, which were clean and brushed and showed evidence of considerable effort. He had a small ring that had been his mother's, the one good thing she had given him before she died when he was 12, which he had carried in the bottom of his saddlebag through 8 years of moving, and which she understood, receiving it from his hands now, represented everything he had kept and protected through all of it, everything he had refused to let the hardness of his life take from him. She said yes before he had finished asking. She said it laughing, which was apparently her response to the most important moments, and he put the ring on her finger and it fit as though it had been made for her, and he pulled her to him and held her with a tightness that told her about his relief, about how much he had feared she would say something else, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt his heartbeat, and thought that this was the thing she would always remember, this precise moment. The Sunday morning light and the ring on her hand, and the sound of his heart. They were married in Redrock 3 weeks later, on a Saturday, with the justice of the peace and a small gathering of people who had come to matter in the months of this story. Pearl Adler, who brought dried flowers from her garden. Tom Gallagher from the livery, who said nothing particularly eloquent but whose presence communicated warmth in its own practical way. A woman named Dora Finch from 2 properties east who had brought Esther food in the worst weeks of the previous winter, without making a production of it, and who looked at Gideon with the assessing eye of a woman who had buried her own husband and knew what she was evaluating. Dora Finch declared him, at the reception held on Esther's porch with cider and dried fruit cake, and the kind of simple abundance that people on the frontier created out of what they had, acceptable, which Esther understood from Dora Finch was the highest available grade. Owen Bristol did not come. He had heard about the marriage through the usual channels that existed in small communities, and his response had been to go quiet in the particular way she had learned to watch. She did not mistake his silence for retreat. But she was married now, and Gideon was no longer a hired hand on her land but her husband, which changed the legal and social geometry of Owen's options in ways that were not trivial, and she allowed herself to spend her wedding day without concerning herself with him. Gideon danced with her on the porch in the evening, just the 2 of them, with Tom Gallagher playing his fiddle, a slow waltz that was imperfect and real and everything a waltz needed to be. She rested her forehead against his jaw and felt his arms around her and heard him say, very quietly, against her hair, "I did not know it was possible to be this grateful for something." She said, "You are going to have to get used to being happy, Gideon Abbott," he said. "I'm working on it." The winter of 1883 came hard and early, the way it sometimes did in the high desert, the first snow arriving in November and staying, and the farm required everything they had to manage the cold season. But they managed it together, which made it entirely different from the solitary management that had been Esther's life before. The wood was stacked. The animals were warm. The root cellar was full of enough to carry them through. In the evenings there was the fireplace and the lamp and Gideon reading, which turned out to be something he did with the same total absorption he gave everything, and Esther with her needlework or her accounts, and the comfortable specific silence of two people who have made peace with each other's presence. Owen Bristol made his final move in December. He came with two men she did not recognize, which was new, and he came after dark, which was also new, and which told her the calculation had moved into a different register. They were at the south fence when Gideon spotted them from the window, three figures with lanterns moving too slowly to be passing through, moving with the deliberate pace of people who were planning something. Gideon went out. She went with him, because she was not the kind of woman who stayed inside, and she had made that clear when they had discussed, in the general way of people who are practical about living on the frontier, what they would do if someone came to the property with bad intentions. Owen had brought the two men to, as far as she could reconstruct afterward, do something that he would then use to pressure her, perhaps damage to the property or something more direct, something that could be framed as the natural consequence of a woman who would not listen to reason. The presence of Gideon changed his calculation in real time. She could see him revising it as Gideon walked out into the moonlit yard with a very specific quality of composure that communicated, without aggression, and without the kind of display that invited escalation, that this was a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and had no need to prove it. The two men with Owen were paid men, not invested men, and there was a type of paid man who, when confronted with a situation that had become more complex than the fee warranted, made a rational economic decision. Both of these men were apparently that type, because they took their assessment of Gideon and they took their assessment of the moonlit yard and the open land around them, and the way the woman standing beside Gideon had a shotgun resting in the crook of her arm with the ease of someone who used it regularly, and they recalculated. Owen said things that were loud and bitter, and showed the full rotted interior of a grievance that had been calcifying for years. He said things about Clarence and what Clarence had built, and what it meant that she had sold it to a stranger, meaning Gideon, which was not an accurate description of what had happened, but which was the story Owen had built, because it was the version that let him be wronged rather than simply wrong. Gideon listened to all of it without moving. She stood beside him, and she could feel him weighing each word and choosing to give none of them the power they were reaching for. When Owen finally went quiet, Gideon said, quietly and with absolute clarity, "Your brother left his wife a legal deed to this property. That deed is filed with the territory. The circuit clerk and the circuit judge have both reviewed it. You have no claim here, legal or moral. You are welcome to test any of that again in a court of law, and we will meet you there, but you are not welcome on this property." He said all of it without raising his voice. He said it the way he said everything important, with a complete absence of heat that made it land harder than heat would have. Owen left. The two men went with him, and she watched the lanterns diminish down the road and disappear around the curve past the butte, and she stood there in the cold moonlit yard and breathed out slowly. "He won't come back," Gideon said. "Not like this." She thought he was right. Not because Owen had been defeated in any dramatic way, but because there was a kind of man for whom the performance of authority was the point, and who required an audience of some kind for that performance, and Owen had just performed it to two men who had found it insufficient, which was a humiliation he would not rush to repeat. She was right. Owen Bristol did not come back. He sold the feed store to a man from Sacramento the following spring and left Red Rock, and the last she heard of him he was in San Francisco, which was a city large enough to accommodate men with grievances and a need for audiences considerably more efficiently than Red Rock ever could. The spring of 1884 came gentle after the hard winter, and with it a new piece of news that Esther told Gideon on an April morning while the light was young and clean, and the sage was putting out its first small blossoms. She told him with a directness that was characteristic of her, simply and straight, no preamble, and watched his face go through the most remarkable sequence of expressions she had ever seen on a human face, a cascade from shock to comprehension to a joy that was so large and sudden it seemed to physically disorganize him. He sat down on the porch step and put his hands over his face for a moment, and she sat beside him and waited. He looked up. His eyes were wet, which she had not seen before. "A baby," he said. "A baby," she confirmed. "I don't know how to," he started and stopped and started again. "My own family, I have never," he stopped again. She took his hand. "You will know how," she said. "You know how to learn things, remember." He looked at her, and his face was entirely open in the way it had been that first day in the barn. All the careful containment gone, just the real thing visible. And he said, "Esther." And then he put his arms around her and held her with the particular care of a man who was now holding two people and knew it. And she felt his heart hammering against her cheek, and she held on to him, and thought that all the hard and complicated road that had brought them to this morning, hers and his both, had been traveling toward this exact place without either of them knowing it. The pregnancy was relatively smooth, as these things went in the high desert in 1884, where smooth was a relative term. There was a woman in Redrock named Mrs. Hartley, who had midwifed 40 deliveries in the territory, and who came out to the farm twice to check on Esther with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who had seen everything and been unsettled by very little. Esther's health was good. The summer work was distributed between her and Gideon with adjustments made as her body made adjustments necessary, and she managed the discomforts of the season with the same stoic practicality she brought to everything. Gideon, for his part, revealed himself over those months to be someone who had a deep and instinctive capacity for care. Not the performative solicitude that some men deployed to demonstrate their own goodness, but the practical, attentive, specific kind of care that actually made a difference. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He adjusted the farm work accordingly without making a production of it. He read to her in the evenings from the small collection of books she had, which she found, unexpectedly, to be one of the things she loved most. His voice in the lamplight reading Dickens or the occasional newspaper from Salt Lake City that arrived weeks late, but was absorbed with enthusiasm. He also, in those months, built things. He was a man who responded to abundance, she realized, to the richness of what they had, by wanting to make it permanent. He built a proper cradle from pine boards, taking more time over it than anything purely functional required, sanding and fitting, and finishing it with the care of a man who wanted the thing to last. He repaired the house in various ways it had needed repairing for years, adding a second window to the main room to let in more light, fixing the back door that had never hung quite true, replacing the porch boards that had gone soft. He was building a home. She understood that with a tenderness that sometimes sat in her chest almost painfully. He had never had a home, not really, not in the full sense of the word that meant permanence and belonging, and a place in the world that was unambiguously yours. He was building one now with his hands and his attention, and the love that had transformed the farm from the place where she lived alone into the place where they lived together. Their son was born in November of 1884, on a Sunday, which felt appropriate. Mrs. Hartley delivered him and pronounced him healthy and good-sized, and Gideon was there through the labor in the way that some men in that era were not, sitting on the floor beside the bed holding Esther's hand through the worst of it, and talking to her in that low, steady voice about nothing and everything, just keeping her anchored to his presence. When it was over and Mrs. Hartley put the baby into Gideon's arms for the first time, Esther watched her husband hold his son, and saw him cross some threshold inside himself that she knew he had been standing at the edge of for months, the threshold between the man he had been, the solitary drifting man carrying his dark past and his Kentucky childhood and all the weight of his particular journey, and the man he was now, with his son in his arms in the lamplight in the house they had made together. He looked up at her with those gray eyes, and they were wet again, and he said, "What do you want to call him?" "I thought about James," she said. He looked at the baby. "James Abbott," he said, testing it. "James Gideon Abbott," she said. Something moved through his face at hearing his own name given forward like that, carried into the next generation, and he nodded without speaking for a moment, and then he said quietly, "That's a good name." She slept for a long time after that, and when she woke it was deep night and Gideon was in the rocking chair he had brought in from the porch, with James against his chest, and he was making a sound that she gradually recognized as singing, very low, one of the songs from the Kentucky of his childhood that he had mentioned once in passing, and the firelight was on both of them, and she watched them from the bed without saying anything for a while, not wanting to interrupt the thing she was witnessing. She thought about the shawl. She thought about the morning 2 years prior when she had stood in the cold October light with that warm burgundy wool pressed to her chest, and believed, in the most anguished way, that the leaving was the end of everything. She thought about how she had been wrong, and she thought about what it had taken for it to be wrong. All the specific choices and conversations and moments of honesty and fear and courage that had built the path from that fence post in the gray dawn to this firelit room. She thought about the fact that the shawl was still in the house, folded on the shelf in the bedroom where she kept things that mattered, and that she would keep it there always, because it was the evidence of a man who had been trying to take care of her even while he was making what he thought was the sacrifice of leaving, and that it had been warm, and she had run toward the future instead of after him, which had turned out to be the same direction. "Gideon," she said softly. He looked up, and in the firelight his face was everything she had learned it was over 2 years of loving him, careful and strong and capable of more tenderness than he had ever expected himself to contain. "Go back to sleep," he said. "I have him." She smiled and closed her eyes and listened to the low sound of him singing, and the fire and the small sounds of their son, and the winter wind outside the window of the home they had built, and she slept deeply and without fear for the first time in years. The years that followed were good years. They were hard in the ways that frontier life was always hard, drought and market prices, and the physical labor of maintaining land that required constant attention, but they were good in the ways that mattered. The farm expanded. Gideon had an eye for livestock, and they added cattle to the operation in 1886, a small herd that grew steadily under his management. Esther had an eye for everything else, and her garden became something of a local phenomenon, not because she pursued that, but because abundance has a way of generating its own reputation. James grew into a boy with his mother's determination, and his father's gray eyes and a laugh that could be heard from 3 fields away. He was followed, in 1887, by a daughter they named Clara, who arrived in the spring and immediately communicated her opinions about everything with a volume and clarity that suggested she had not experienced any difficulty in finding her voice. And then in 1889, unexpectedly and joyfully, a second son named Thomas, who came into the world quiet and watchful, and proceeded to observe everything around him with a seriousness that at 6 months old was both comic and genuinely impressive. Gideon was a father in the way Esther had believed he would be, learning it as he learned everything, with full attention and without reservation, making mistakes and correcting them without excessive self-recrimination, present in the specific way that a man can be present when he has made a decision to be present and meant it completely. He taught James to ride before James was 4, sitting behind him on the dark bay horse, which was now old and slow and entirely appropriate for the purpose, and the sight of them together on that horse in the late afternoon light was the kind of image that Esther carried in some interior pocket where she put the things she wanted to keep in their most vivid form. He also told them stories. This she had not expected, because Gideon was not a man who used many words, but it turned out that the economy of his daily speech did not extend to the stories he told his children in the evenings, stories that drew on the full geography of his 8 years of traveling, Texas and Colorado, and New Mexico and Arizona, the people he had met, and the places he had seen. All of it rendered into the kind of narrative that made three small people sit very still with their eyes wide. She sometimes listened from the kitchen doorway and thought about the man who had ridden up her road at a walk on a September morning in 1883, and how much of this had been in him already, folded away and waiting for the conditions that would let it open. Pearl Adler retired from the circuit clerk position in 1888 and came to dinner to celebrate, and she looked around the table at the three children and the house and Gideon and Esther and said, with the precision that characterized everything she did, that this was what she had hoped for when she helped with the land documents. Esther, who had not thought of that connection in years, laughed, and Gideon thanked Pearl with a simplicity that Pearl, who was not demonstrative, clearly appreciated. Tom Gallagher came by regularly, and had become the closest thing either of them had to a family of origin, which suited everyone because he was the kind of man who showed up and stayed and could be counted on and did not require extensive management. His fondness for the children was expressed through the gifts he brought them, practical gifts, a good knife for James when he was old enough, a proper horse of her own for Clara when she was 7, a beautifully crafted wooden box for Thomas to keep his various collected objects in. James called him Uncle Tom, which Tom bore with a gruffness that Esther understood was the cover for genuine feeling. Dora Finch, who had declared Gideon acceptable on the day of the wedding, revised her assessment upward over the years with each visit, expressing this revision not through words, but through the quality of what she brought from her kitchen on those visits, which became progressively more elaborate as her estimation of the household grew. Esther found this extremely funny and never told Dora so, because Dora Finch's food was spectacular, and there was no reason to complicate the mechanism that produced it. In 1890, Ridge Rock grew. The railroad came closer, not through the town itself, but close enough that the area attracted new settlers, a few new businesses, a doctor who set up a proper practice, and changed the texture of illness and emergency in ways that Esther found deeply meaningful, having managed the territory's previous medical limitations with the pragmatism of someone who had no alternative. The town school, which had operated intermittently on the generosity of various local families, became a permanent institution, and James started attending in the fall of 1890 with the specific expression of a child who has been waiting for exactly this. She found Gideon one evening that September standing at the paddock fence, watching the sun go down behind the ridge in the long, slow way it did at that time of year, and she stood beside him and he put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood like that while the light changed and the stars came out. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said, "when I found the shawl." He was quiet for a moment. "So do I," he said. "I was angry," she said. "I know," he said. "You had every right to be." "I was also," she said, considering the honesty of it, terrified that I would just accept it. That I would go back inside and live the way I had been living before you came and tell myself it was enough. "What stopped you?" he asked. "The shawl was warm," she said. He looked at her. "It meant you hadn't been gone long," she said, "which meant you were still in the world, still reachable even if you hadn't reached back yet. It meant the connection was still live." She paused. "It also meant you had thought about me. In whatever dark and tangled way you were thinking about leaving, you had still thought about me being cold." He was quiet for a long moment, and she felt the arm around her shoulders tighten slightly. "I told myself I was doing the right thing," he said. "Leaving before I made things harder for you, before Owen Bristol could use me as a weapon against you, before Hargrove's men could make your property dangerous." He paused. "I told myself all of that very convincingly at 4 in the morning. And then you left the shawl," she said. "And then I left the shawl," he said, "which rather undermined the purity of the sacrifice." She laughed, and he did too, quietly, and she thought, "This is what we are. We are the shawl and the warmth and the failure to look back that was not a rejection but a desperate act of love. And we are also everything that came after it. All the conversation and honesty and hard work and joy and children sleeping in the next room. All of it built on that one imperfect gesture of a man who did not know yet how to stay but who had stopped, despite himself, to make sure she was warm. "I should never have left," he said. "No," she agreed. "But you came back." "You made it possible," he said. "We made it possible," she said. The last good light went behind the ridge and the stars were enormous overhead, and the children's voices came from inside the house. James and Clara arguing about something with the specific passion of siblings, and Thomas making his observational sounds from wherever he was watching the argument, and the farm was dark and quiet around them. The animals settled for the night, the crops harvested, and the root cellar full, and the wood stacked against the coming winter. Gideon turned and looked at her in the near dark, and she could see his face in the starlight. All the years on it now that had not been there when he rode up her road the first time. The good years written over the hard ones in the particular way that happiness has of gradually becoming the dominant register of a face that has earned it. "Esther," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said, "for the fence post, for not going inside." She reached up and put her hand against his face, the way she had put her hand against his chest that very first time on the porch, just that, the warmth of his skin under her palm, and she said, "Thank you for the shawl." He covered her hand with his, as he always did, and they stood there in the dark together while the stars turned overhead, and the children's voices rose and fell in the lit house behind them. And she felt the full weight of the word home, not the building and the land, though those things mattered and she had fought for them and would always be glad she had. But the thing that could not be measured in acres or deeds or tax assessments. The thing that was made of two people who had looked at each other honestly and decided that what they saw was worth staying for. She had found the shawl at the fence post on an October morning in 1883, warm in the gray dawn, and the warmth had been the message, had been the whole message. The secret thing he had not been able to entirely keep from her even in his most determined moment of sacrifice. And she had kept that warmth against her chest and walked back into her life and let the thread run out to where it would reach, and then she had pulled on it, gently and with her full strength. And this was what she had pulled toward her. This was what the warm shawl had meant. Not an ending, never an ending, only the place where the real story was just beginning to take shape. Inside the house, Clara called for her mother, and Thomas laughed at something James said, and the lamp in the window was very bright against the dark. And Gideon opened the paddock gate and they walked back toward the light together, his hand in hers, the shawl around her shoulders where it had been 100 evenings by now, soft with wear and full of everything it had witnessed, warm as it had always been, warm as it would always be.